Welcome and well met, all my fellow adventurers. Thank you for joining me here as we go on with today's lesson, where we're going to look more into the history of Hydaelyn, or as its proper name we learned but recently, Etheirys. This is going to be part 2, where we'll be picking up where we left off from last week, where we already discussed the prehistory of the world that we know of before the Sundering. So please sit back and listen and enjoy the upcoming tale of the first Umbral era, the first Astral era, and the Calamity of Wind. We are just going to do a quick recap, just in case you missed that lesson. But for the prehistory of the world, what little we do know of it is that the world goes back at least 13,000 years, where mankind were once powerful beings that could use creation magics and live nigh on eternity if they wished to. At least until a series of events ended up triggering a terrible calamity known as the Final Days, where mankind was just barely able to pull themselves back from complete annihilation, with the summoned gods Zodiark and Hydaelyn doing battle until Hydaelyn emerged victorious, though at the cost of the world as it once was, for it and everyone upon it were sundered into the source and its 13 reflections. The only ones having escaped this fate were 3 members of the old government of the Convocation in the forms of Lahabrea, Elidibus, and Emix-Selk. With them began their great work on rejoining the reflections all together to the source so that they could rebuild the lost world. So, the Sundering happened roughly around 12,000 years ago, and thus began a new chapter of mankind's history. As a result of the Sundering, though, the people were stripped of their creation magics as well as their near immortality, becoming more like the people that we know of as today. It is also theorized that the different races that we're all familiar with today come from these ancient ancestors, though it is unclear if the races immediately came into being from their sundered bodies, or if a series of evolutions happened to take place gradually afterwards. But moving on to today's lesson, we're going to be looking more into what we do know of the world after the Sundering, and of both the first Umbral era and the first Astral era. As I explained in the last lesson, Eorzea is characterized by elemental calamities which plunge the realm into short yet harrowing periods of chaos known as Umbral eras, followed by extended periods of prosperity known as the Astral eras. What then, you may ask, of the land before the first calamity struck? Well, drawings from the songs and writings of countless civilizations, theologians believe prehistory to be a pretty chaotic time of uncontrolled creation overseen by a god or multiple gods. Creation which abruptly ended with the destruction of all that exists, ultimately allowing for the rise of mankind from the wreckage. From this, we could only theorize that they were talking about the final days in these records. So it stands to reason that the people, at least at the very beginning after the Great Sundering, were able to hold on to some kind of memory before they were sundered into pieces. Before we get too much into that, I do want to point out more of what the Ascians were up to during this time. It is safe to say that the 3 remaining Convocation members were hard at work trying to discover a way to be able to restore their world to what it once was. I can imagine that they must have come to discover the other reflections and studied up the new planes of existence as well as the people who were living there, while also locating their sundered souls of their own Convocation members. How many there were during this time, we don't know, but we do discover that there was at least one other Ascian by the name of Egeorm who was raised up to her place upon the Convocation. We know this because she seems to be the one who was directly responsible for triggering a calamity upon the 13th shard. I believe that it's safe to assume that the Ascians were experimenting to see what they could do to rejoin the worlds, but they ended up getting too carried away, for in their haste, they ended up triggering a calamity of darkness upon the 13th shard. We're still learning more about the history of said shard, but it is important to understand exactly what the rejoinings are, for they are the reason that we've had calamities upon the source. To put it simply, a rejoining is an etheric phenomenon that occurs when the source violently reabsorbs the ether of one of its 13 reflections. the result ending in the complete destruction of said reflection and triggers a terrible calamity upon the source. Yet for rejoining to occur properly, you need two very specific conditions at the same time, otherwise it will not work. The first condition is an abnormal ascendancy. You see, the source and its reflections have an invisible connection to each other, despite the fact that they are separate. In that case, each world has its own etheric balance that is composed of the same elements. So if one of the reflections has one of these elements more prevalent than the others, or attains abnormal ascendancy, the excess ether will start to be pulled from across the rift towards the source. With this extra ether on the source, it will influence the balance, which causes disruptions and disasters matching the element that is coming in. The second condition that is needed is going to be a crack in the barrier. Once a reflection meets the first condition, then the barrier or wall that separates the reflection from the source will start to grow thin, eventually becoming weak enough that it will break. After that, all that's going to be needed will be an event of sorts to be powerful enough to crack the weakened barriers between worlds. This causes the remaining ether from the imbalanced reflection to pour the remaining ether into the source all at once, creating a flood of that element on the source world. To give an example, if a reflection has a surplus of, say, water ether, then the excess ether will start to flow to the source, thus affecting its own balance of the elements in the form of, say, heavy rainfall. This in turn weakens the walls built up around the source and the reflection until a big enough event, let's say a war takes place, could cause the wall to crack and thus absorb all the remaining ether from the reflection in an attempt to repair it. So meanwhile, all that remaining water ether that flows into the source could trigger massive floods or monsoons to such a degree that it's on a near apocalyptic level, thus resulting in an event that we refer to as the Umbral Calamity. It's unclear at this point if the crack in the barrier has to occur from an event on the source or in the imbalanced reflection. Personally, I do think it has to take place on the source. But the reason I bring all of this up is because it is because of this process that we have had several calamities happen upon the source that end up changing the history of the world each and every time. But also because it was during this time between the Sundering and the first Umbral Calamity that the Ascians attempted to trigger a rejoining without fully understanding the connection of both the source and its reflections. The result was transforming the 13th into what we know as today as the Void. We have reason to believe that the 13th met all the conditions of Condition 1, as was made evident by the existence of the Void Gates, but why it was never able to properly rejoin is something we're still not 100% sure of, but the 13th has been in a state of complete darkness since before the first Umbral Calamity, which was between 12 to 10,000 years ago. It's not until after what happened to the 13th did the Ascians become fully aware of this connection, as well as the proper process to trigger a rejoining, which we do find out later with the first Umbral Calamity, which ends up being responsible for rejoining the 5th shard to the source. It was not until the advent of the 6th Umbral era, however, that by process of elimination, scholars were able to declare with certainty that the elemental calamity which ushered in the first Umbral era was indeed connected in some way with wind, possibly in the form of terrible hurricanes, tempests, or tornadoes. According to research, it does appear that there had once been a vast continent that remained suspended in the sky before the calamity took place, but it was thanks to that and these vast wind disasters that this land was broken up and possibly crashed into the world below. I actually came up with a theory on what this land could have been and what happened to it, so if you want to watch it, I will leave a link in the description down below. But either way, thanks to recent dealings with the Mughals of Moghom, in which village elders have spoken of a wind-driven disaster previous to the first 5 calamities, served to further reinforce this theory. Sadly, there is little else that we know of during this time with the arrival of the first Umbral Calamity, or the Calamity of Wind as it's more commonly known. It was said that the gods once walked Eorzea during this time, and it was with the arrival of mankind that the gods left this plane entirely. Whether this part is true or not, we're still looking into thanks to the Myths of the Realm series that we've been studying up on, but we'll talk more about that another time. Other things that we are at least fairly certain about are things like the legend of Good King Mogomog XII and how he supposedly helped his subjects leave a floating island to safety to the ground before the Calamity destroyed them. But it also appears that Midgardsormr, the father of dragons, arrived to the source around this time as well, having escaped from the destruction of his home star by Omega. He arrived here with 7 eggs that he raised until they reached adulthood, and eventually they spread wing to all corners of the world. These 7 dragons became known as the First Brood, or the Great Worms, and they would further establish the dragon race. Meanwhile, Midgardsormr himself enters a deep slumber, or a kind of hibernation at the bottom of a lake, which will one day be known as Silvertear Falls. Otherwise, it was after the result of the Calamity of Wind that it is considered to be the beginning of modern history. Eventually, with the scars of the Calamity of Wind fading, it entered into its first time of peace, or the first Astral era. And this is what we'll refer to as a time of stone and fire, because it's believed that during this era, mankind was able to learn the essentials for survival, such as how to carve stone tools, hunting, and the ability to make fire. Cave paintings dating back to the first Astral era suggest that there were once existence of hundreds of now lost species, everything from a 2-headed bison to winged coral-like scalekin to trees reaching over 1,000 yalms in height. During this period, tools allowed for the rise of agriculture and a departure from hunting and gathering, which eventually resulted in the abandonment of a nomadic lifestyle and saw the establishment of villages and towns. With these towns, civilization thrived and basic science such as animal husbandry and simple metallurgy were discovered and refined. As the towns grew, they eventually became the first kingdoms of man. However, kings, as their wont, are rarely content with what they have, and soon the leaders of the newly formed kingdoms abandoned the creation of tools for the forging of weapons, and the era descended into blood-stained madness. For the first Astral era ended with descent into constant wars for supremacy between kings trying to expand their domains. They gutted mountains to forge their weapons of war and despoiled the land to such a point that nothing could grow. It was this that the second Umbral calamity would be upon them, the Calamity of Lightning. Anyway, everyone, that will be it for today's lesson. Please don't be disappointed, but I felt that we needed to end on a good note, or at least an interesting note. But I want to thank you all for joining me, and I hope that you enjoyed learning not just about the first Umbral and Astra eras, but also about the rejoinings and the effects that they have as we proceed further on with our studies. In the next lesson, we will be discussing more about the Calamity of Lightning, as well as the second Umbral era and the second Astral era, and what we know of them. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe down below for future videos, and I hope to see you during our next lesson. Until then, may you walk in the light of the crystal.